What if the true meaning of Independence Day wasn't written in history books, but carved in blood and sacrifice by a man whose name was forgotten by time? If stories of courage and sacrifice move you, subscribe to our channel and hit the bell icon, because today's tale will shake you to your core. The summer of 1875 hung heavy over Magnolia Plantation like a suffocating blanket. Located deep in the backwoods of Mississippi, far from the prying eyes of federal authorities, this isolated estate existed as if the Civil War had never ended, as if Lincoln's proclamation was merely ink on distant paper. Master Jonathan Whitmore ruled his domain with an iron fist wrapped in the velvet glove of Southern gentility. To visiting neighbors, he was the epitome of old-world charm, silver-haired, impeccably dressed, with a smile that never quite reached his cold blue eyes. But those who lived under his roof knew the truth. Magnolia Plantation was a prison disguised as paradise. The main house stood like a white monument to cruelty, its columns casting long shadows across the cotton fields, where dozens of souls toiled under the merciless sun. Despite the Emancipation Proclamation being over a decade old, Whitmore had convinced his workers they had nowhere else to go, that the outside world would destroy them. Fear and isolation were his greatest weapons. Among the weathered buildings that housed the workers, one structure stood apart, a reinforced barn that served as punishment quarters. It was here that the most troublesome individuals were kept, chained and broken, until their spirits surrendered to Whitmore's will. And it was here that Elias had spent the last 3 years of his life. Elias was a giant among men, standing nearly 7 feet tall, with shoulders broad enough to carry the weight of the world. His dark skin bore the roadmap of countless beatings, raised scars that told stories of defiance, of a spirit that refused to break despite every attempt to crush it. His hands, massive and calloused, had once been gentle enough to comfort crying children and strong enough to lift fallen trees. But what made Elias truly dangerous in Whitmore's eyes wasn't his physical strength. It was the fire that still burned in his dark eyes, the intelligence that no amount of brutality could extinguish, and the way other workers looked at him with something that terrified the plantation owner: hope. The chains that bound Elias were specially forged, thick iron links that would have held a wild bull. They connected heavy shackles around his wrists and ankles, allowing him just enough movement to perform basic functions, but ensuring he could never fully stand upright or extend his arms. The constant weight had worn deep grooves in his skin, permanent reminders of his captivity. Sarah, a woman in her 30s with prematurely grey hair and eyes that had seen too much sorrow, often brought him his meager meals. She had been at Magnolia since childhood, and her own daughter, little Mary, had been born into this nightmare. Sarah moved with the careful grace of someone who had learned to be invisible, but when she looked at Elias, something flickered in her expression, a mixture of admiration and desperate hope. "The master's been talking about selling some folks down to Louisiana," she whispered one evening as she slipped a piece of cornbread through the barn's wooden slats. "Says the plantation's getting too crowded." Elias's jaw tightened. Louisiana meant the sugar plantations, where life expectancy was measured in months, not years. "Who?" he asked, his voice a low rumble that seemed to vibrate through the wooden walls. "The families with children," Sarah replied, her voice breaking. "He says they eat too much and work too little." The giant's massive hands slowly clenched into fists, the chains rattling ominously. For 3 years, he had endured every humiliation, every beating, every degradation Whitmore could devise. He had watched good people broken, seen children grow up knowing nothing but fear, witnessed the slow death of hope in too many eyes. But this, the threat to tear apart the few families that remained intact, this was the final straw. That night, as the plantation settled into its uneasy sleep, Elias began to plan. He had been studying the routines of the guards, memorizing the layout of the buildings, calculating distances and timing. His engineering mind, a gift that Whitmore had never suspected, had been working on this problem for months. The barn where he was held also housed 12 other men, all chained like animals, all broken in different ways. There was old Tom, whose back was permanently bent from years of cotton picking. Marcus, barely 18, but already bearing the hollow look of the defeated, and Samuel, who had arrived just weeks ago, still carrying the shock of a man who had believed freedom was real. "Listen to me," Elias whispered in the darkness, his voice carrying just far enough to reach the others. "Tomorrow is July 4th, Independence Day. While Whitmore celebrates his freedom, we're going to claim ours." The silence that followed was heavy with disbelief and terror. These men had been conditioned to expect punishment for even thinking about escape, let alone planning it. "Elias," old Tom's voice quavered, "they'll kill us all. You know what happened to the last ones who tried to run." "They're going to kill us anyway," Elias replied, his voice steady and sure. "Slowly, piece by piece, until there's nothing left of who we used to be. But tomorrow, we choose how our story ends." Marcus shifted in his chains, the metal scraping against the wooden floor. "Even if we could get out of these chains, there's nowhere to go. They'll hunt us down with dogs." "Let me worry about the chains," Elias said, and something in his tone made the others lean closer. "And as for where to go, there's a network of people, good people, who help folks like us reach the north. Sarah's cousin made it to Ohio last year. The Underground Railroad didn't die with the war, it just got quieter. Samuel, the newest arrival, spoke up with the desperation of a man clinging to hope." "How do you know all this?" Elias was quiet for a long moment, remembering. "Before I came here, I was a free man. I had a trade. I was a blacksmith in New Orleans. I knew how to read, how to write, how to think. Whitmore bought me from a slave trader who claimed I was a runaway, but the truth is, I was kidnapped, taken from my shop in broad daylight, because someone wanted my skills, but not my freedom. The revelation hung in the air like a physical presence. A free man reduced to this. It was every enslaved person's worst nightmare and every free person's greatest fear. "Tomorrow," Elias continued, "we don't just escape. We free everyone. Every man, woman, and child on this plantation gets a chance to choose their own fate. And if some of us don't make it—" He paused, the weight of leadership settling on his massive shoulders. "Then at least we'll die as free men, not as property." As the first hints of dawn began to creep through the cracks in the barn walls, Elias closed his eyes and thought of his forge back in New Orleans, of the satisfaction of shaping raw metal into something useful and beautiful. Tomorrow, he would shape something far more precious than iron. He would forge freedom itself. The giant had made his choice. Now all that remained was to see if he possessed the strength to break not just his own chains, but the chains that bound an entire community to a nightmare that should have ended a decade ago. Outside, the plantation slept on, unaware that Independence Day 1875 would bring a reckoning that would echo through generations. July 4th, 1875, dawned with an oppressive humidity that seemed to press down on Magnolia Plantation like a physical weight. The air was thick with the promise of thunderstorms, and a strange ethereal mist clung to the ground, creating an almost otherworldly atmosphere as the sun struggled to penetrate the heavy clouds. Master Whitmore had planned an elaborate Independence Day celebration, complete with a barbecue for the neighboring plantation owners and their families. The irony wasn't lost on anyone, celebrating freedom while keeping dozens of human beings in bondage. But such contradictions were the foundation upon which the Old South had built its identity. In the main house, preparations were already underway. The kitchen staff, led by an elderly woman named Mama Ruth, worked frantically to prepare enough food for the expected guests. The smell of roasting pig and baking cornbread filled the air, a cruel reminder to the workers of the feast they would never taste. Sarah moved through her morning duties with unusual nervousness. Elias's words from the night before had planted a seed of hope in her heart, but hope was a dangerous thing in a place like Magnolia. She had seen too many hopes crushed, too many dreams turned to nightmares. As she carried breakfast to the punishment barn, her hands trembled slightly. Little Mary walked beside her, carrying a small bucket of water. At 8 years old, Mary had never known anything but the plantation, but lately Sarah had caught her daughter staring longingly at the birds that flew freely overhead. "Mama," Mary whispered as they approached the barn, "why do the birds get to go wherever they want, but we have to stay here?" Sarah's heart clenched. How do you explain to a child that some people believe they own other people? How do you tell your daughter that her freedom was stolen before she was even born? "Sometimes, baby girl," Sarah said carefully, "things aren't fair, but that doesn't mean they'll always stay that way." Inside the barn, Elias was awake and alert, his massive frame coiled with tension despite the heavy chains. He had spent the night working on the first link in his plan, literally. Using a technique he had learned in his blacksmith days, he had been gradually weakening one of the chain links by repeatedly flexing and twisting it at a specific point. The metal was beginning to show signs of fatigue. When Sarah appeared with his breakfast, Elias caught her eye and nodded almost imperceptibly. It was time. "Sarah," he said quietly, "I need you to do something for me. Can you get word to the others? Tell them that when they hear the dinner bell ring 3 times in a row, they should be ready to move, and tell them to stay close to their families." Sarah's eyes widened with understanding and terror. "Elias, if you're caught—" "If I'm caught, I'm dead anyway," he replied simply. "But if I succeed, your Mary might grow up knowing what it feels like to choose her own path." The morning passed with agonizing slowness. Whitmore's guests began arriving around noon, a collection of plantation owners, local politicians, and their families, all dressed in their finest clothes and carrying themselves with the casual arrogance of people who had never questioned their right to own other human beings. Among the arrivals was Sheriff Coleman, a thin, wiry man with cold eyes and a reputation for brutality that extended far beyond the boundaries of his jurisdiction. He had been the one to track down the last group of escapees, and his methods of justice were legendary in their cruelty. "Jonathan," Coleman said as he dismounted from his horse, "I hear you've been having some trouble with your property lately. That giant you keep in the barn. He's been asking too many questions, stirring up the others." Whitmore's smile was as cold as winter frost. "Nothing I can't handle, Sheriff. Elias just needs a reminder of his place. I was thinking of making an example of him tonight after the festivities. Let everyone see what happens to troublemakers." The conversation sent a chill through Sarah, who was serving drinks on the main house porch. She caught the eye of Marcus, who was helping with the horses, and saw her own fear reflected in his expression. Word spread quickly through the plantation's informal communication network. Elias was going to be killed tonight. In the barn, Elias felt the weakened chain link finally give way with a soft metallic ping that was barely audible over the sounds of celebration from the main house. His right hand was free, though he kept it positioned as if still chained. The first step was complete. The afternoon dragged on with the surreal quality of a fever dream. While the plantation owners celebrated their independence with speeches about liberty and freedom, the people who actually understood the value of those concepts remained in bondage, watching and waiting. Old Tom had managed to pass word to the families in the quarters, using a system of signals that had been developed over years of careful observation. a certain way of hanging laundry, a particular arrangement of tools, the direction someone faced while working. All of these carried meaning in the silent language of the oppressed. As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and red that seemed almost prophetic, Elias made his final preparations. He had used his free hand to work on the other chains, and while they weren't completely severed, they were weakened enough that his massive strength could break them when the time came. The dinner bell rang once, calling the guests to the evening meal. The sound echoed across the plantation like a death knell, and Elias felt his heart rate increase. Soon now, very soon, in the main house, the plantation owners gorged themselves on food prepared by enslaved hands while discussing the problem of freed slaves in the post-war South. Their conversation was a mixture of nostalgia for the good old days and resentment toward the federal government that had interfered with their way of life. The thing is, one guest was saying, these people don't know how to be free. They're like children. They need guidance, structure. Left to their own devices, they'll just cause trouble. Whitmore nodded sagely. Exactly why I've maintained the old ways here at Magnolia. It's really for their own good. They have food, shelter, purpose. What more could they want? Sheriff Coleman laughed, a sound like breaking glass. Speaking of purpose, when are you going to deal with that giant of yours? I brought some special equipment that might help convince him to be more cooperative. The special equipment was a set of torture devices that Coleman had acquired during his years of maintaining order in the post-war South. The thought of what they planned to do to Elias sent waves of nausea through the kitchen staff, who could hear every word through the thin walls. As the evening meal concluded and the guests moved to the porch for cigars and brandy, Elias heard the dinner bell ring a second time, the signal for the evening shift change among the guards. He flexed his muscles, feeling the weakened chains strain against his strength. The third ring would come soon, and with it, the moment that would determine whether July 4th, 1875, would be remembered as just another day of celebration for the oppressors, or as the day when a giant named Elias proved that true independence could never be given. It had to be taken. In the distance, thunder rumbled ominously, as if the very heavens were preparing for the storm that was about to break over Magnolia Plantation. The third ring of the dinner bell cut through the humid evening air like a blade, its metallic voice carrying across Magnolia Plantation with the weight of destiny. In the punishment barn, Elias felt every muscle in his massive frame tense as the sound faded into the gathering dusk. This was it. The moment that would define not just his fate, but the fate of every soul trapped in this nightmare. With a surge of strength born from 3 years of suppressed rage and desperate hope, Elias pulled against his remaining chains. The weakened metal links, already stressed beyond their limits, snapped with sounds like gunshots in the confined space. The heavy shackles fell from his wrists and ankles, clattering to the wooden floor with a finality that seemed to echo through time itself. For the first time in 3 years, Elias stood to his full height. 7 feet of muscle and determination, he was a sight that would have struck fear into the heart of any man. But as he looked at his fellow prisoners, still chained and staring at him with a mixture of awe and terror, his expression was gentle, almost paternal. "Brothers," he said quietly, his voice carrying the authority of a man who had found his purpose, "tonight we choose freedom or death. There is no middle ground." Moving with surprising grace for such a large man, Elias approached Old Tom's chains. His massive hands gripped the central link, and with a twist that seemed to defy the laws of physics, the metal parted like paper. Tom gasped, rubbing his wrists in disbelief. One by one, Elias freed his fellow prisoners. Marcus, Samuel, and the others watched in stunned silence as their chains fell away. Some wept openly, Others simply stared at their freed hands as if they belonged to someone else. "Listen carefully," Elias said as he worked. "We have maybe 10 minutes before the guards make their evening rounds. Sarah and the others are gathering the families near the old oak tree behind the quarters. Our job is to get everyone out of the main compound and to the river crossing. From there, we follow the North Star." Samuel, still struggling to believe what was happening, asked, "What about the guards, the dogs? They'll come after us." Elias's expression hardened. "They'll try, but they'll have to go through me first." Outside the barn, the plantation was settling into its evening routine. The guests from the Independence Day celebration were still on the main house porch, their laughter and conversation providing perfect cover for what was about to unfold. The guards, relaxed by the festive atmosphere and perhaps a bit too much celebratory whiskey, were not as alert as they should have been. Sarah had done her job well. Using hand signals and whispered messages, she had managed to gather most of the families near the designated meeting point. Children clung to their mothers' skirts, sensing the tension in the air, but not understanding its source. The adults moved with the careful quiet of people who had learned that survival often depended on invisibility. Little Mary tugged at her mother's dress. "Mama, why is everyone acting so strange? Are we going somewhere?" Sarah knelt down and took her daughter's small hands in hers. "Baby girl, do you remember what I told you about the birds, how they can fly wherever they want?" Mary nodded, her 8-year-old eyes wide with curiosity. "Well, tonight, we're going to try to be like those birds." The barn door opened slowly, and Elias emerged into the misty evening air. Behind him came the other freed men, moving like shadows given substance. The sight of the giant, finally unchained and standing at his full height, sent a ripple of emotion through the gathered families. Hope and fear intertwined in equal measure. "Everyone listen," Elias said, his voice carrying just far enough to reach the assembled group. "We move together, we stay together, and we protect each other, the children and elderly in the center, the strongest on the outside. If we're separated, remember, follow the North Star to the river, then follow the river east until you reach the old mill. There are people there who will help." Mama Ruth, the elderly kitchen supervisor, stepped forward. Despite her age, her eyes burned with a fierce determination. "What about you, Elias? You're talking like you're not coming with us." The giant's smile was sad but resolute. "Someone has to make sure you all get away safely. Someone has to hold them back long enough for you to reach the river." The implications of his words hit the group like a physical blow. Marcus grabbed Elias's arm. "No, we all go together or nobody goes. That was the plan." "Plans change," Elias replied gently, removing Marcus's hand. "This is bigger than any one of us. This is about making sure that little Mary and all the other children here get a chance to grow up free." Before anyone could protest further, the sound of approaching footsteps cut through the night air. 2 guards were making their evening rounds, heading directly for the punishment barn. They were laughing about something one of the guests had said, completely unaware that their world was about to change forever. Elias moved with the fluid grace of a predator. Despite his size, he covered the distance to the guards in complete silence. The first guard, a cruel man named Pike who had taken particular pleasure in tormenting the prisoners, never knew what hit him. Elias's massive hand clamped over his mouth, while his other arm wrapped around the man's throat, cutting off both sound and air circulation. Pike dropped unconscious to the ground. The second guard, a younger man named Davis, had just enough time to register what was happening before Elias was upon him. Davis reached for his pistol, but the giant's hand closed over his wrist with crushing force. The gun fell to the ground as Davis gasped in pain and terror. "Listen to me very carefully," Elias whispered, his face inches from Davis's. "You're going to walk away from here and forget what you saw. You're going to tell everyone that all was quiet on your rounds. If you raise an alarm in the next hour, I will find you, and what I do to you will make your worst nightmares seem like pleasant dreams." Davis, faced with 7 feet of barely controlled fury, nodded frantically. Elias released him, and the young guard stumbled away into the darkness, too terrified to look back. "Now," Elias said, turning back to the group, "we move, quickly and quietly." The procession began, a river of humanity flowing through the misty darkness toward an uncertain but hoped-for freedom. Families held hands, parents carried children, and the elderly leaned on the strong. It was a sight that would have moved the hardest heart. Dozens of people who had been treated as property finally claiming their humanity. Elias brought up the rear, his massive frame serving as both guardian and shield for those ahead of him. Every few steps he would pause to listen, his senses alert for any sign of pursuit. The plantation was large, and they had to cross nearly a mile of open ground to reach the relative safety of the river. They had made it perhaps halfway when the inevitable happened. A shout rang out from the direction of the main house. Someone had discovered the empty barn. Within moments, the peaceful evening was shattered by the sound of alarm bells and shouting voices. "Run!" Elias commanded, his voice carrying over the chaos. "Don't look back, just run!" The group broke into a desperate sprint, parents scooping up children, the young helping the old. Behind them, the plantation erupted into activity as guards grabbed weapons and torches. Dogs began barking, and horses were hastily saddled. Sheriff Coleman's voice cut through the night like a whip crack. "Get the dogs! Get every man with a gun! I want that giant brought back alive! I have special plans for him!" As the escapees reached the edge of the cotton fields, Elias made his choice. The group was moving too slowly. The children and elderly couldn't maintain the pace needed to outrun mounted pursuers. Someone had to buy them time. "Keep going," he shouted to the others. "Get to the river. Don't stop for anything." Sarah turned back, tears streaming down her face. "Elias, no, come with us." "Take care of Mary," he replied, his voice carrying a finality that chilled her to the bone. "Tell her that some birds are meant to fly, and others are meant to make sure the sky stays clear." With that, the giant turned and began walking back toward the approaching torches and baying hounds. His massive frame seemed to grow larger with each step, as if he were drawing strength from the very earth beneath his feet. The last thing the fleeing family saw before disappearing into the darkness was Elias standing alone in the cotton field like a colossus, waiting to face an entire plantation's worth of armed men with nothing but his bare hands and an unbreakable will. Behind him, freedom beckoned for dozens of souls. Ahead of him, certain death waited with the patience of the grave. But Elias had made his choice, and he would not waver. Tonight, on Independence Day 1875, a giant would prove that true freedom was not something that could be given or taken away. It was something that lived in the human heart, indestructible and eternal. The final chapter of his story was about to be written in blood and sacrifice. But the stories of those he saved would be written in hope and possibility, echoing through generations yet unborn. The mist that had clung to Magnolia Plantation all day now seemed to swirl around Elias like a living thing, as if the very air itself recognized the magnitude of what was about to unfold. Standing alone in the cotton field, the giant could hear the approaching thunder of hoofbeats, the baying of bloodhounds, and the angry shouts of men who had just discovered that their property had claimed its humanity. Behind him, growing fainter with each passing moment, he could hear the sounds of the escaping families. The soft footfalls of people running toward freedom, the muffled sobs of children who didn't understand why they were running, the whispered prayers of adults who dared to hope for the first time in years. Elias closed his eyes for a moment and thought of his forge back in New Orleans, of the satisfaction that came from shaping raw metal into something beautiful and useful. Tonight, He was shaping something far more precious. He was forging freedom itself, and like all great works, it required sacrifice. The first horseman to reach him was Sheriff Coleman, his face twisted with rage, and his pistol already drawn. Behind him came Whitmore and a dozen armed men, their torches creating a circle of flickering light in the darkness. "Well, well," Coleman sneered, his horse dancing nervously as it sensed the tension in the air. The mighty giant standing all alone. "Where are your friends, boy? Where are my runaway slaves?" Elias stood perfectly still, his massive frame radiating a calm that was more terrifying than any show of anger could have been. When he spoke, his voice carried across the field with the authority of a man who had found his purpose. "They're not your slaves, Sheriff. They never were. They're human beings, and tonight they chose to be free." Whitmore spurred his horse forward, his face purple with rage. "You've cost me thousands of dollars, you ungrateful animal. Do you have any idea what those people were worth?" "More than you could ever understand," Elias replied quietly. "But not in the way you think." The plantation owner raised his rifle, his hands shaking with fury. "I'm going to make you pay for this. I'm going to make you suffer in ways you can't imagine." "You already have," Elias said, and for the first time his voice carried a note of sadness. "For 3 years you tried to break my spirit, to make me forget that I was a man. But you failed, Whitmore. You failed because you never understood that freedom isn't something you can take away. It's something that lives in here." He placed his massive hand over his heart. Coleman laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Pretty words from a dead man. Boys, spread out. We're going to take him alive. I have some special entertainment planned." The circle of armed men began to widen, their weapons trained on the giant. But Elias didn't move, didn't show any sign of fear. Instead, he began to speak, his voice carrying across the field with the power of a preacher delivering a sermon. "You want to know where they went? They went toward the North Star, toward freedom, toward a future where their children won't grow up in chains. And you'll never catch them, because while you waste time with me, they're putting miles between themselves and this place." "Shut your mouth," Whitmore screamed. But Elias continued. "Sarah's little girl, Mary, she asked her mother why birds get to fly wherever they want. Tonight, that little girl learned the answer. Tonight, she learned that some cages can be broken." One of the guards, a young man who had always seemed uncomfortable with the brutality of plantation life, lowered his weapon slightly. "Maybe we should just let them go," he said quietly. "The war's been over for 10 years. Maybe it's time to—" "Shut up, Davis," Coleman snarled. "Point that gun at the giant, or I'll shoot you myself." But Davis wasn't the only one affected by Elias's words. Several other guards were shifting uncomfortably, their weapons wavering. The giant's calm dignity in the face of certain death was having an effect that Coleman hadn't anticipated. The moonlight caught the scars on Elias's chest and arms, each one a testament to his endurance, his refusal to surrender his humanity despite years of systematic brutality. He stood like a monument to resilience, his very presence challenging everything these men believed about the nature of power and submission. In the flickering torchlight, his dark skin seemed to absorb and reflect the flames, making him appear almost supernatural in his composure. "Look at yourselves," Elias said, his voice now carrying the weight of prophecy. 12 armed men, afraid of one unarmed giant. What does that tell you about the strength of your convictions? What does that say about the righteousness of your cause? Whitmore's horse reared nervously, sensing its rider's agitation. "He's trying to confuse you," the plantation owner shouted. "Don't listen to his lies. He's nothing but property, valuable property that needs to be reclaimed." But Elias's words were having their intended effect. The younger guards, men who had grown up hearing stories of the war, who had been told that slavery was a noble institution, were beginning to see the contradiction between their beliefs and the reality standing before them. Here was a man, clearly a man, not property, facing death with more dignity than they had ever witnessed. "I've been thinking," Elias continued, taking a step forward that made several rifles swing toward him, "about what it means to be free. You men think you're free because you carry guns, because you own land, because you can tell other people what to do. But look at you now. You're slaves to your own fear, chained to a system that requires you to deny the humanity of others to maintain your own sense of worth." Coleman's face contorted with rage. "Enough of this philosophy. You're going to pay for what you've done, and you're going to pay slowly." Elias took another step forward, and this time his movement was deliberate, purposeful. "You want to know what real freedom looks like, Sheriff? It looks like choosing to stand here knowing I'm going to die, because it means that dozens of people I care about have a chance to live. It looks like sacrificing everything for something bigger than yourself." The giant's words hung in the air like a challenge, and for a moment even the night sounds seemed to pause in respect. The crickets stopped chirping, the wind stilled, and the only sound was the nervous breathing of horses and the distant baying of hounds that were still trying to pick up the trail of the escaped families. "You can kill me," he said, his voice now carrying the weight of prophecy, "but you can't kill what I represent. You can't kill the idea that all men are created equal. You can't kill the dream of freedom." "Watch me," Coleman snarled and pulled the trigger. The shot rang out across the field like thunder, and Elias staggered but didn't fall. Blood bloomed across his chest, dark against his shirt. But he kept walking forward. "Is that all you've got?" he asked, his voice still strong despite the wound. "I've been shot before. I've been beaten, whipped, chained, and broken. But I'm still standing." Coleman fired again, and again Elias staggered but remained upright. The other men began firing as well, their shots echoing across the plantation like a deadly drumbeat. But the giant kept coming, step by inexorable step, until he was close enough to reach out and touch Coleman's horse. "How?" Whitmore whispered, his face pale with shock. "How is he still standing?" Elias looked up at the sheriff, blood running from the corner of his mouth, but his eyes still burning with unquenchable fire. "Because I'm not just fighting for myself anymore. I'm fighting for every person who ever dreamed of freedom. I'm fighting for Mary and Sarah and all the others who deserve better than this." With his last surge of strength, Elias reached up and grabbed Coleman's leg, pulling the sheriff from his horse. The two men crashed to the ground, and for a moment they struggled in the dirt, but Elias was dying, his massive strength finally failing as his life's blood soaked into the Mississippi soil. Coleman scrambled away, his face white with terror. "Finish him!" he screamed. "Finish him now!" The remaining guards opened fire, their bullets finding their mark again and again. But even as he fell, Elias managed to smile. In the distance, barely audible over the gunfire, he could hear it, the sound of freedom, the sound of people who had chosen to be free, running toward a future that he would never see but had helped to make possible. As the giant's eyes closed for the final time, his last thought was of his forge in New Orleans, and the satisfaction that came from creating something that would outlast the creator. Tonight, he had forged the greatest work of his life, not from iron and fire, but from courage and sacrifice. The shooting stopped, and an eerie silence fell over the cotton field. Elias lay still, his massive frame finally at rest, his face peaceful despite the violence of his death. Around him the armed men stood in stunned silence, as if they couldn't quite believe what they had just witnessed. "Is he dead?" Whitmore asked, his voice barely a whisper. Coleman approached the body cautiously, his gun still drawn. But there was no need for caution. The giant was gone, his spirit finally free from the chains that had bound his body. "Yeah," Coleman said finally, "he's dead." But even as he spoke the words, the sheriff felt a chill that had nothing to do with the night air, Because somewhere in the darkness, dozens of people were running toward freedom, carrying with them the story of a giant who had sacrificed everything to give them a chance at a better life. And in the years that followed, as those people built new lives in the North, as they raised children who would never know the weight of chains, as they told and retold the story of Independence Day 1875, Elias's sacrifice would take on the weight of legend. Sarah would tell Mary about the giant who broke his chains so that others could break theirs. Marcus would name his firstborn son Elias, in honor of the man who showed him what true courage looked like. Old Tom would live to see the dawn of the 20th century, and with his dying breath, he would whisper the name of the giant who gave him back his humanity. The plantation owners tried to suppress the story, to erase Elias from history as if he had never existed. But stories like his have a way of surviving, of passing from generation to generation like sacred flames that can never be extinguished. Because on July 4th, 1875, while America celebrated its independence with parades and speeches, a giant named Elias proved that true freedom cannot be given by governments or taken away by tyrants. True freedom lives in the human heart, and it can only be claimed by those brave enough to pay its price. The giant was dead, but his legacy would live forever, in the children who grew up free, in the families that stayed together, in the simple truth that some things are worth dying for. And on quiet nights, when the wind blows across the cotton fields of Mississippi, some say you can still hear it. The sound of chains breaking, the sound of freedom being born, the sound of a giant's heart beating with the rhythm of justice itself. Elias had paid the ultimate price, but in doing so, he had purchased something priceless, the freedom of dozens of souls, and the proof that no chain is strong enough to bind the human spirit forever. His story would echo through the generations, a testament to the truth that freedom is not free, but for those brave enough to claim it, it is always worth the cost. The true measure of a man is not in how he lives, but in what he leaves behind when he's gone. 25 years later, in a small church in Ohio, an elderly woman named Sarah stood before a congregation of former slaves and their children. Her hair was now completely white, and her hands bore the marks of a lifetime of hard work, but her eyes still held the fire that had carried her through that terrible night in 1875. Beside her stood Mary, now a grown woman with children of her own, a schoolteacher who had dedicated her life to ensuring that the next generation would never forget the price of their freedom. "Today," Sarah said, her voice carrying clearly through the packed church, "we remember a giant named Elias, not because he was the biggest or the strongest, but because when the moment came to choose between his own life and our freedom, he chose us." In the congregation, old Tom nodded slowly, his bent frame a testament to years of suffering, but his presence a testament to the power of hope. Marcus sat with his son Elias, now 24, and a successful businessman in Cleveland. Samuel, who had become a minister, wiped tears from his eyes as he remembered the night that changed everything. "Some of you," Sarah continued, "have asked me why we gather every July 4th to tell this story, why we insist on remembering pain when we could celebrate joy. The answer is simple. We remember because forgetting would dishonor his sacrifice. We remember because our children need to know that freedom is not a gift, but a choice that must be made again and again." Little Mary, now Mary Johnson, mother of 3, stood and addressed the congregation. "My children ask me about the scars on my mother's wrists, about why we came to Ohio, about why their grandfather's name was Elias. And I tell them the truth, that sometimes one person's courage can change the world for dozens of others." The service ended with a song, not a hymn of mourning, but a song of celebration, of lives lived in freedom, of children raised without chains, of dreams that had been purchased with blood but had bloomed into reality. After the service, as the congregation filed out into the bright Ohio sunshine, a young reporter from the Cleveland Plain Dealer approached Sarah. He had heard rumors of this annual gathering, whispers of a story that had never been officially recorded. "Ma'am," he said respectfully, "I'd like to write about your story, about this man Elias. The world should know what happened." Sarah studied the young man for a long moment, seeing in his earnest face the same hunger for truth that had driven Elias to break his chains. "Yes," she said finally, "the world should know, but remember this, Elias wasn't special because he was big or strong. He was special because when the moment came to choose between safety and sacrifice, he chose love. He chose us." The reporter scribbled notes frantically, trying to capture not just the facts, but the emotion behind them. "What would you want people to remember most about him?" Sarah looked up at the clear blue sky, where birds flew freely in all directions, and smiled. "I want them to remember that freedom is not about the absence of chains. It's about the presence of choice. Elias could have chosen to escape alone, to save himself and leave the rest of us behind. Instead, he chose to make sure that every person on that plantation had a chance to choose their own fate." "And the cost?" the reporter asked gently. "The cost," Sarah replied, "was everything. But what he bought with that cost, the freedom of dozens of people, the future of their children, the proof that no human being is property, that was priceless." As the reporter walked away, already composing the story in his mind, Sarah felt a gentle hand on her shoulder. It was Mary, now with her own children gathered around her. "Mama," Mary said softly, "do you think he knew? Do you think Elias knew that his sacrifice would mean so much to so many people?" Sarah considered the question, remembering the giant's calm certainty in those final moments, his peaceful acceptance of what had to be done. "I think," she said finally, "that he knew exactly what he was doing. I think he understood that some things are bigger than any one person, and that sometimes the greatest victory comes through the greatest sacrifice." That evening, as families across Ohio sat down to dinner in homes they owned, as children played freely in yards where they could run without fear, as parents tucked their children into beds knowing they would wake up free, the story of Elias spread a little further. The reporter's article would be picked up by newspapers across the North, carrying the tale of the giant who broke chains on Independence Day, to readers who had never heard of Magnolia Plantation, but who understood the universal truth at the heart of the story. And in the years that followed, as America struggled with the ongoing legacy of slavery, as the country grappled with questions of equality and justice, the story of Elias would serve as a reminder that progress often comes at a terrible price, paid by those brave enough to stand up when standing up means standing alone. The giant was gone, but his legacy lived on, not in monuments or statues, but in the lives of free people, in the laughter of children who would never know chains, in the simple truth that love is stronger than hate, courage stronger than fear, and freedom stronger than any force that seeks to destroy it. On July 4th, 1875, while America celebrated its independence, a giant named Elias proved that true independence is not declared by governments, but claimed by individuals willing to pay its price. His story would echo through the generations, a testament to the power of sacrifice, the strength of love, and the unbreakable truth that no chain is strong enough to bind the human spirit forever. Each year, as the descendants of those he saved gathered to remember, they would light candles not just for Elias, but for all those who had chosen courage over comfort, sacrifice over safety, love over fear. The giant had fallen, but giants never truly die. They live on in every act of courage, Every choice to stand up for what's right, every moment when someone decides that freedom is worth fighting for. And that, perhaps, is the greatest independence of all. If this story of courage and sacrifice moved you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and share this video with others who need to hear about the giants among us, both past and present. Because in a world that often feels dark, we all need reminders that light can come from the most unexpected places, and that sometimes one person's courage can change everything. What other untold stories of courage would you like us to explore? Let us know in the comments below.